What does lose yourself and gain the world mean? I think all of this really starts with our conception of self. So we're here to talk a little bit about the new mantra. What do you see the self as?
To lose yourself, it would be...
Not the fire. What is the self?
The self is just about everything we identify with. What separates us from other creatures and other people. It's what gives us opinions and preferences and desires. The only thing that isn't the self is the awareness that is resting inside of us. The only thing that's not changing. The self is constantly changing and made up of so many little pieces you can't really point at it. It's everything, and it's nothing because it's not one single spot in us, in our mind, in our heart, nothing. And I would say that the part of ourself that is awareness is the only part of ourself that is pure and inherently loving. For some reason, as you let go of more of yourself, more of your preferences and desires, when you're not thinking those thoughts and you're kind of open to letting thoughts arise, that's when loving thoughts come up, and that empty awareness.
If a ship sails around the world and it sheds every single one of its boards, when it lands back home, if it's changed out every board and every sailor even, is it still the same ship? Well, what if it retains one board, one original board? Is it then? What if it retains 50% of all the boards that it originally had? What about then? It's all missing the point. It's surprising to me that it's a thought experiment that's even still debated. But it really does show just how captive to our thoughts we really are. The real answer is that Theseus' ship is a concept. That ship itself is not really any individual thing. It's made up of a bunch of individual pieces that come together, which eventually form something that we conceive of being the ship. The boards are from trees, which were made out of dirt, which is made out of minerals. There's no point at which it suddenly is a ship. There's just a point at which people point at it and say, now it's a ship, now it's not a ship. And we point at it and say, it's still that ship or it still isn't that ship, but it all only exists in conception.
Yeah, I think just like the ship, we're always changing. I think a lot of people look back and say, I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago or when I was a kid or something like that, but there wasn't one day where you were just a different person. You were changing every single day of your life. Sometimes it's harder to see than others. But we're always changing, just a little bit at a time.
And everything changes the kind of person that we are. We want to imagine that there's this central core to ourself, and it's easier to imagine if you don't undergo a lot of change. Yet there are too many examples of people undergoing a tremendous amount of change that makes them into a different person. There was the happening where, I think he was a railroad worker, had a piece of rebar go through his skull, and it might be reductive to say that he was suddenly a different person, but those people who were a part of his life said that he was dramatically changed by that he became a more temperamental person. If you lobotomize someone, they become very dumbed down.
And you can see it in any dramatic life change. Like, if you lose someone that's really close to you, you'll see a significant change in yourself or in your life. But it's not just the big things that change us.
Obviously, that's why we are heavily into self-regulation, because we see that every little thing that we consume changes what we are. Whether it's the TV that we're watching, or the people that we're associating with, or the music that we're listening to, or the experiences that we're subjecting ourselves to walking across the country. Some of it makes you weaker, some of it can make you stronger, some of it can make you more irritable, and it all changes the thoughts which manifest out of the ether.
That makes me think of how I don't always know how to fully express my thought on this to people when they say, I could never do that, or something of the sort related to walking the country. But I wasn't the person I am now. The person that started the walk on day one, I wouldn't say that is the kind of person that can walk across the country. You just become that from doing it. The walk has made us tougher, more resilient, and able to be happier while walking.
For those of you who don't know, Paige had never been camping before she met me. In fact, she struggled to order food at restaurants.
Just very nervous and shy and timid, and so quiet you could barely hear me. You probably still see on some videos that I'm a little bit inaudible. But yeah, I feel like a completely different person just in the last few years, and especially from the beginning of the walk till now.
But one of the things that I appreciated about Paige the most was that she shared a desire to overcome those traits. She wasn't just identifying with those traits, but believed that she could become something else. When we first took off in the van and we reached the forest in the middle of the night after we had traveled hundreds of miles away from home.
And hours into a dark forest.
Yeah, hours into a dark forest.
In the middle of nowhere in Mississippi.
Paige didn't want to get away from the van because it cast a certain amount of light on the ground from the inside. And because of her fear, I suggested that you walk out into the middle of the dark blackness and turn off your flashlight for a few minutes.
And I was really irritated with him at first, and I kept fighting him and telling him, I don't care if you're right, I'm not doing it, I don't want to. And eventually, I was like, fine, you're right, I want to overcome it. And very irritatedly, I went out to the woods.
Now we sleep in the dark all the time.
Yeah.
In a tent with a bunch of weird sounds that are often unidentifiable.
Yeah. I remember that moment, looking up into the trees, and it became kind of beautiful. Seeing the very, very dim light of the moon after my eyes adjusted to the tall, thick trees.
You still retained some portion of who you were that I can recognize, but I think it would be possible for you to become so different if I were to communicate with you in some way that veiled your appearance or even your voice. I might not recognize that it was you, depending on how much change you underwent. Like at any point in your life, that could be said of any person. It's very difficult to hold on to our qualities. That's why, if somebody leaves their home state and they venture off north or south, they develop the accent of their surroundings. But we don't only develop accents, we develop everything. If you surround yourself with conservatives, you're more likely to become conservative. Our beliefs are always adapting to our environment.
Even strong-willed people. Good principles and virtues can be malleable to the people and environment they're in.
It makes me think of Alphonse.
That's what I was just thinking of too.
So in Kansas, while someone who had biked across the country was hosting us, they had taken us to a local bar, in this town of 200 people in North Theater, Kansas, and someone rolled in on a recumbent bike in a Hawaiian shirt with a very foreign accent. And our host invited him over as well. He was biking across America at that particular point in time. Very strange coincidence. His name was Alphonse, and he was a psychoanalyst from Austria. And the most interesting moment in conversation came up. Our host had asked, there are a lot more good people out there maybe than you had realized before you took off cycling across the country. Don't you see that there are a lot more good people out there? And Alphonse said, I don't like the term good people. It's kind of a weird topic for us to approach because we're often talking about the goodness in people, but what Alphonse went on to say is very relevant. He said that he had become a psychoanalyst specifically because he wanted to figure out how it was that such seemingly good people could be made to do such horrible things. His father had been a Nazi, but kind of propelled his life in this direction to figure out why seemingly good people could do such terrible things.
We also talked about how we can all kind of agree that it's useful in communicating just to colloquially say good people or bad people, but there really isn't such a thing that you can say someone is one or the other. Good people do bad things and bad people do good things. We're all some combination. We all make mistakes.
And the goodness is often reciprocal. We're rubbing off on everybody, moment to moment, all the time. And we mirror the actions of others and the people that we're around.
It's also somewhat subjective to say anything is good or bad. Almost anything you could come up with, you could find someone who thinks it's bad if you think it's good, and vice versa.
There are sadists and there are masochists. The recognition of that plasticity and the way that we interact with one another, if you can acknowledge that, you can become more resilient yourself because you know that these processes are at work on you all the time. And so you can then place yourself in a more observational state to realize what you're doing when you're doing it. Am I just reciprocating? Or can I go so far as to turn the other cheek? The acknowledgement of these facts allows you to act more selfless and not just be reciprocal.
A lot of people see us and see what we're doing, and we have a sort of message to uphold. So we've kind of had to test ourselves in moments where we've had, not that there's been a lot, but there have been a few people who have been super kind to us, and we've really taken on the goal to not just be reciprocal, and even if you could say it's justified to tell them, like, defend ourselves or say something negative back. We've been able to work towards being kind in every situation. It's a nice test of it. Can you uphold your virtues no matter what the other person's doing?
It might be important to revisit Theseus' ship at this point because a lot of what we're talking about is often understood at face value, but the implications of it aren't totally absorbed. One of the best things that we can do to learn what the self really is by isolating the different portions of personhood through various introspective processes. Depending on where you direct your attention can determine those things which are present internally and psychologically. There's a lot that we can do with our mind. Inadvertently, many people repress memories. We can lose basically all of it.
Probably never perfectly. It'll always be an oscillation, but you can work to not be selfish or desirous or have too many preferences or opinions and judgments that are loving.
That the self is a concept can be shown scientifically, it can be shown introspectively, and it can be shown philosophically. Scientifically, through MRIs, we can actually see the different portions of the brain which are responsible for self-referential thinking, most commonly referred to as the default mode network of the brain. And there are things that we can do to downregulate the default mode network of the brain. Meditation does that. Certain drugs can do that. And there are some people that just have a less active default mode network.
And you could say that isolation and fasting can do that too, right?
Yes, I would say that it can do that too. Although I don't know what the actual clinical studies on that have proffered up so far. I would say that it can do that in the same way that we know everything that we do changes our brain, right? Whether it's meditation or reading or behavioral therapy, you can grow portions of your brain that are less active, or shrink portions of your brain that are overactive. Like one of the big things that they've been showing recently in some of the studies is that through meditation, you can actually shrink your amygdala, the portion of your brain that's responsible for fear. And also through meditation, although it takes a longer time than the shrinking of the amygdala, you can grow gray matter itself, which helps with defense for certain things like Alzheimer's and dementia. And obviously, we have various portions of the brain mapped out. We know what the neocortex does in relation to other systems and the frontal lobe, and we know that if people have more or less developed portions of the brain, they're more or less inclined to things like being a psychopath or being overly emotional. And those things themselves can change based on what we do with our activities. It's not necessarily true that you can read yourself into a totally different brain size and shape. We can be genetically predisposed to certain issues, but at the same time, it would only take a surgeon who really knew what they were doing and proper computer modeling systems to go in and hack away different parts of your brain that are responsible for things that really do make you you. There's no place in there to put your finger on a self. And I would say that introspectively, there's no place to put your finger on a self. Introspectively, if you're anything, you're awareness itself, right? Because within your own consciousness, you can lose an enormous number of things just by where you're putting your attention or your awareness. You can shed memory, and you can shed your inner monologue, and you can shed different concepts. You can look at things in a different way. We've all experienced looking at something for the first time, right? You look at a thing that someone has made and you have no idea what it is whatsoever. And it really is novel. We don't often get that once we're adults. We don't get to see that anymore. Form develops over time. Our conception of that thing, we eventually write it off. If you could imagine seeing like a TV screen for the first time, or a phone for the first time, you would have no idea what to think about it yet.
It would be magical.
It would be magical, yeah.
And sadly, when we figure out how it all works, it loses its magic from our perspective. It doesn't have to.
That's true. In fact, I would say and argue that you can tap into that conceptualist state of mind. It's very difficult, and it takes a lot of work, and you might only be able to hold on to it for a moment. But through the right processes, you can get closer to what it's like to see something for the first time again. And that's really important for not taking things for granted.
Just like when you're with someone all the time. It helps to appreciate other people and especially your partner, if you're with them all the time. Just a little bit of time apart can make you appreciate someone or something so much more.
With regard to the way that we visually experience things, there are people, when you see them, after you fall in love with them, they actually become prettier. And you've heard older people, I never understood this when I was younger, older people say that their partner, who was 60 or 70 years old, has grown prettier every single day. That's not necessarily a lie.
Yeah.
That can literally actually happen depending on the love that you have for that person.
Yeah, I used to think that they were just trying to, stroke their confidence or whatever.
Yeah.
That was a cheesy, not so true thing, but I think they might actually be seeing them more beautiful. Because if they're growing to love them more and more throughout their years, I think it's very possible.
Yeah. Your brain, as you fall in love with someone, starts to lose its pickiness in some ways. You're not observing the things that you would observe when you first meet someone. Like, oh, they've got a big nose.
Or you still see it, but instead of seeing it as a flaw, you grow to love it.
Mm-hmm.
Because you love them.
And this is probably most easily seen for oneself when they fall out of love with someone.
Yeah.
You separate from someone, you get divorced or something, and you grow a hatred and a resentment for that person, and then you bump into them on the street one day, or you have to get back in touch with them for some reason, and you're like, I was in love with you? You are so ugly. I don't think that's just memory playing a trick on us. We do actually visually see things different based on our conceptions of those things. Everything is plastic, malleable and shapeable. One of the takeaways from it is that you have an impact on everything that's around you, and everything around you has an impact on you. It is healthier in a way to see yourself as not being isolated from everything and everyone else. You begin to realize that everything you do makes a difference, and everything around you is making a difference on you. And with that knowledge comes the power of being able to do a lot more about it. You start giving attention to all of the little things that create these tiny changes in you, and you can begin to shape yourself in different ways, but you can also begin to shed layers of the things that comprise yourself. And
you can use that as a tool to shed layers that are things that are making you anxious or unhappy. I think a lot of people with mental health problems, if they were to take on this thing we're talking about, the view of the self, you could see how shapeable your own mind is. And you could use your environment as a tool to help overcome those things. If you accept that you're not stuck in that place, you don't have the disease anxiety or the disease depression, but you are in a state of that, you can get out of that.
And there are different ways to look at things like anxiety and depression. You'll literally begin to produce different chemicals in your brain if you do healthier things for yourself. That is scientifically true. If you eat more fruits and vegetables, you're less likely to be out of balance. Your food consumption will change the cortisol levels in your body, which can result in things like states of anxiety and depression. And people talk about dopamine fasting. They want to step away from all of the stimulating stuff so that they can become stimulated again by things. But we shouldn't just do it as a one-time fix sort of thing. It's like we're going
diet.
Yeah, like a month-long diet. We shouldn't treat it like a diet. It's not healthy if your goal is to shed 20 pounds, but then you're going to go right back to eating the way that you were. You have to look at it as a lifelong thing. You're always going to be monitoring your diet. You're always going to make sure that you don't fall too away from fitness and health.
That makes me think of me and Torin have gone back and forth with how strict we are with dieting and exercise, and we've gone really deep into restricting ourselves with our diet and really routinely working out. We've become in some of the best shape that we've ever been in together, and we've felt how different it makes you feel. It makes you happier. You're not just more energized, you're literally happier and you're healthier.
And it changes the way that you perceive certain things. For instance, I was eating seasonless turkey burger and broccoli and blueberries. That's all I was eating every day, regularly, because it fit my macros and did pretty well with my micros while I was trying to put on muscle. I was training for our wedding because I wanted to be in the best shape of my life, and I succeeded.
Me too.
Which I'm quite happy about. 195 with abs. But through doing that, I noticed something very strange. At first, it's bland and flavorless and terrible, and you can get tired of it too, even down the line. But what I began to notice was that I was picking up flavors in there that I couldn't detect before. Because I was oversalting everything, and I was, everything's always covered in mayonnaise and salt and sugar. I was tasting the sweetness in the broccoli. I was tasting like the ironiness in the meat, the minerals in it, in a different kind of way.
I feel like it's partly your taste buds changing, but also partly just your mental perspective.
Yeah, I think it's both taste buds and perception.
So how do you lose yourself?
How do you lose yourself?
Not to be mistaken for losing yourself in the moment. Not that sort of losing yourself.
Yeah.
That's why we have this space. Lose yourself.
Yeah. The space between the your and the self is very intentional. You're not losing yourself to gain something selfishly. You're shedding those layers of identity which separate you from everything else. And the way that we do that is by not consuming the things that cause us to identify so strongly as being so separated from other people. A good example would be, I think, rap music. Paige and I both used to listen to rap when we were younger, and it's very egocentric. It is about the overcoming of other people in so many ways, right? Overcoming haters, making money for yourself, and even though we wanted to consider ourselves good people and those weren't like at the core of our morals, it still develops a difference in thought pattern with regard to who you are and your importance in the world.
You might not take on all of those things literally, but everything we take in will affect us to some degree. Even if it's just making you think more or think slightly more selfish thoughts, because it's all about gaining for yourself. And it's hard to see that, so you have to be careful what you consume one thing at a time. It's interesting to go extreme in different directions back and forth and see the difference in yourself. If you work hard to, you can definitely see the difference. Like with diet, you'll see it more than ever if you go super healthy and fall off and go back and forth.
That's one of the best means of losing yourself, is you're better off to know how to regulate yourself if you go extreme in certain circumstances, so that you can see what it's like to look through a different lens. Because when it's so many little minute changes that are occurring internally, we're really just carried along with it. We don't see what's going on. So what you have to do is you have to do something extreme. And for me, it started on the trail. I backpacked several hundred miles through the mountains. You don't have cell phone service, you're not like watching TV and YouTube all the time, and you have a lot of time to think and a lot of time to not think. It becomes easier to not think. That was kind of the first step into it, but then You realize that you can do it in so many ways. You can do it by restricting yourself dietarily. You can do it by giving your attention to something other than your inner monologue for long bouts of time.
The walk is a catalyst to lose ourselves. Just starting it, not even after seeing how we've grown, but from the jump, leaving everything behind that makes you feel comfortable or secure, leaving behind the person that you were, letting go of people's opinions of you to kind of reshape yourself and grow.
Leaving behind your preferences and judgments so that you can get along with everybody.
Yeah.
Paige and I, just as a means of surviving, it starts out that you have to be polite to people that are saying things that you obviously would disagree with, that you think are damaging to the world. There are people that, we were making friends with at the beginning of the journey that we would have never reached out to ourselves in normal daily life. And yet, what we ended up finding was that we were actually making friends with them. We were actually seeing the hearts of people that we would have written off in the past. And it was only because we were taking the first step, and we were stepping outside of ourselves to loose ourselves of those judgments.
Yeah. You figure out how to empathize with just about any type of person. You can become friends with any of them.
If you can stop clinging to what you think you know, and the things that you identify with, I like this, but you like that. Sports teams are a big thing here in Alabama. And I think just bringing that up and saying anything bad about it could be something that will differentiate me from the people down here that we're with. But that's kind of the point. That really is the point. Paige and I aren't saying negative things about sports, even though we see them as being something that for no good reason, ends up separating one person from another.
Yeah. It's sad, but it is that way with so many people. We shouldn't be making enemies of people that are different from us in any way.
Yeah.
Especially not something so outside of our own lives like that, because we're cheering for different people.
It's something that we have to assign meaning to. It doesn't make us a better person to be on this sports team side or that sports team side.
And back to what you were saying about what we left behind, our opinions and judgments, to trying to be open originally for survival. But now I feel naturally inclined to not have as much judgment and get along with people. We've also realized that if you were to confront people with what you believe and put that wall between you from the jump and tell them why they're wrong or how they could be better, if you're not careful, you're not going to be able to change them for the better. You're not going to be able to maybe show them a way forward. If you do anything but lead with love, you're not helping the situation or the person. There's no point in arguing or telling someone why they're wrong. And first thing you need to do is build common ground, build trust, and care about the person before you try and change their hearts.
The Mennonites seem like such a good example for everything we're talking about right now. While we were with the Mennonites, I noticed that there was not much talking about what they actually believed going on. Whereas when you integrate with many Christian communities, they're trying to convert you in some way or preach to you in some way. And the Mennonites just weren't doing that we were just socializing and spending time together. And I was taken to meet the bishop by the pastor who we were staying with. And I asked him, a lot of different denominations think that they have it right and that the rest of Christendom or religions have it wrong. So what evidence would you hand me to say that you guys have the right religion? And he said, well, we don't have like a book or something that I can give you. I don't have a statement that I'm going to use to win you over. There's nothing There's nothing really to be said about it. If you look at everything that we're doing and the people that we are, and you don't see that it's the truth, there's nothing left to say. Not only are the Mennonites a good example for what we can do for others just through our composure, leading by example, but they're also a great example of what the self is in lack of certain things. Because the Mennonites grow up without TV or smartphones, and they're reading for entertainment instead, their thought structures are entirely different. The way that they form sentences is different. Their attentional capacity is different. They have longer attention spans. They can stay on point longer than other people can. And they also don't have desires for certain things. Now, I think everybody who is trying to regulate themselves and avoid sinful inclinations, let's say, there will always be some kind of desire weighing on them. But the interesting thing about the Mennonites is that because they haven't been exposed to certain things, they've never even had the opportunity to develop certain desires. And if, let's say, they have had the opportunity to develop certain desires, like those Mennonites which leave and come back or come in from outside, because they're in an environment that is not exposing them to things which stimulate those desires all the time, they still just aren't as aggressively burdened by the weight of those desires. It's easier to overcome because they don't just have a support group, but they have a group of people that don't pay any attention to it. To pay attention to the avoidance of certain things means that you're giving attention to those things in the first place. And there it is in your mind as something to actively fight. And sometimes it's best to figure out how to direct our thoughts away from that. And we can't do that if we're always exposed to it. So that's another good reason as to why we want to regulate what's coming in.
You can really see how much more happy and content they appear to be. And we were with them for several days. I don't think any of it was put on. They seem a lot happier, more content than most of America. Most people, couples, families that we've been with. They're not as restless. They're not as anxious and overthinking. They're more at peace in their own heads. And they don't feel judgmental. I had the idea before we went there that they might be a little judgmental of people that aren't doing what they're doing, or if they think they're doing better at certain things than others, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like they just wanted to help people as much as they could.
One of the interesting things that I noticed was a lot of you have probably seen the picture of Paige in the Mennonite dress. There was a moment where Paige was in short shorts. She was doing laundry, but the mother of the family had asked, the boys are about to come home. Would you mind
covering your legs?
Covering your legs? Is that
okay? How?
Yeah, there wasn't really a judgment, right?
It didn't feel tense even.
Yeah.
I thought if someone had presented that situation to me before, like, that feels awkward, I thought that was tense, but she said, would you mind covering your legs? I said, oh, sure, of course. Do you have something for me that I could borrow? She said, oh, sure, would you like this or that? And we had a fine time. It never felt like there's this wall here and you were different from us.
But I think part of that is because the Mennonites in many ways, and this is what Paige and I connected with them on so much, really recognized how soft and pliable we are as people. And so it can develop those desires in a person's mind if they're exposed to, let's say, legs regularly. Now, I'm not saying where Paige and I come out on what we ought to do with our bodies here, but I'm saying I have an appreciation for that perspective.
Yeah.
And it wasn't judgmental because it was just, listen, we know that this is the way that people work. It's not a big deal. I don't think that you're a bad person for having your legs out. Just, we're trying to keep ourselves regulated. Do you care? Would that be fine?
Yeah.
It was
I
really-
respect it because their family and their community is working hard to try and shape their minds in a healthy way. And
Yeah.
I see that. I understand that that's a tool that they're using to do that.
Doesn't an illusory self invalidate the idea of any objective morals?
The negative traits you might say about the self, things that we hold as identity, can also be used as a tool. It's not completely bad. You can take on traits to try and help people and be a better person. It doesn't really matter what label you put on it. Just trying to make the world a better place, trying to help people be happier in their own heads, trying to show people by example how to be loving and connect with others. That's all that really matters.
Yeah. And I think to argue against the idea of the self as being an emergent property by saying that it invalidates morality in some kind of way, it's not really valid. The fact is, that is what the self is. There's nothing that we can really do about it. If we want it to be a different way, and we want the self to be this static, singular entity, and we're all individuals, and none of us, our core will never change. We can want that all we want, but it's just not true. There are too many examples of people who have changed to the core, and there are too many examples of what we know about the way that the brain works. I mean, we can do it, right? We can go in there with a scalpel and just make someone a different person. So we have to respond to this in the most healthy and beneficial way that we can, and I think the most healthy and beneficial way that we can is to acknowledge that nobody wants to experience suffering. And so the best thing that we could do for the world is to train people how to alleviate their suffering. To acknowledge that the self is comprised of the things that we take in, and that the thoughts that we think are an extension of our environment in some way, is one of the best paths to alleviating suffering. And it's a better way of connecting with our world. It allows us to not be so attached to who we are in relation to some other person. It helps us to not demonize the other side of things, and instead accept people, recognizing that they're kind of a culmination of their environmental experiences as filtered through their genetic predispositions. I think it allows us to empathize with people better. None of us chose to be born where we were born, or grow up in the way that we grew up. We were all placed on some kind of a path that leads to the formation of what we eventually become. And the best thing that we can do, regardless of where we find someone at any particular point in their life, is to be the example that if we regulate what comes in, or we don't hold ourselves too attached to ourselves, we can lose suffering and lack judgment, get along with our fellow man better, and get along inside of our own heads better.
And what does it mean to gain the world? I think when you do the things that you're just talking about and let go of more anxieties and the desire for control, and you learn to empathize with other people, you are gaining everything that you could ever ask for if you only ask for the healthiest things. You're gaining more love, more connection. You're experiencing less suffering in your own mind. Those are the things that you care about.
You're not gaining the world materially by any stretch of the imagination. The world, as it is a world of people, is what you're gaining. And you're gaining people because you're not setting yourself apart from them in such strenuous ways. You're acknowledging that they have been developed throughout a series of events that has shaped them, and they might not realize the way that they work or know how to change what they are. They might, because of their own predispositions, not have it within them to even desire that. But we don't have to be an enemy to that person. We don't have to demonize that person. And
With love.
it also helps because the evil that's found in any other person is in some way found within each of us, or the goodness that's found within any other person is also found within each of us. Those principles are still at play in any one of us, regardless of who we are, but they are developed or lost based on what a person does with themselves or the way that their brain was from birth. It's not just that they're evil, it's that there's so many factors that come together to make a person what they are at any given time. And instead of seeing that they're not like us, we can see those negative aspects of us and what we could have been or what we should avoid becoming, and use that as a tool without judging them for it as if they were just a monster.
Yeah. I'm trying to lose ourselves and leave so many things behind. We don't want to swap. We have gained the world in certain ways already. We've gained the ability to connect with people. We've made so many friends. Connected with people who are so different from us, believe different things, live different lifestyles. Getting the support and encouragement to keep walking.
I think we've done a good job of setting the example that if you let go of these discriminating factors, you can be friends with almost anybody.
At the very least, you can get along with almost anybody.
Yeah, at the very least, you can get along with almost anybody.
Yeah.
If we exercised what we know the best we could, you could love everybody. It's very difficult to do.
Yeah. I find myself saying I love you more and more to people.
Me too.
There's no reason to hold back with it, I don't think. I think it's special to say it romantically. That is something a little different, but it shouldn't be something so cheesy and like frowned upon, like, oh, that's so weird. You just told someone that you love them and you don't know them very well. Like, why wouldn't you love them?
Yeah, why wouldn't you love them?
Why can't you love them?
Why do we have to make sure that they are what we think we should be if we know that we're looking through a muddled lens? We know that there's no way to ever perceive things 100% accurately because our conscious lens is so variable and shaped by what we do with ourselves. To acknowledge the nature of self, both as it is illusory and an impediment and a lens through which you see everything differently, just depending on the way you're spending your time, means that there's never any self-righteous judgment that you deserve to have. You should always be looking at your fellow man and going, I might be that one day. I have been that at some point in time.
If I had their upbringing, if I had the same obstacles that they had, I could be in that exact position.
Mm-hmm. You never know. And
even if you did, it shouldn't matter.
Even if you did, it shouldn't matter. There is only other reason to love your neighbor.
It's interesting that because of the principles, the values that we hold about trying to love others and get along with everyone that I feel so naturally. It's like a muscle that I've been practicing. It's more natural to develop that care for people, but I years ago wouldn't have wanted to talk to or spend time with, or would have had so much more judgment for her. And it's silly. But I would have, we don't need to be that way. We can exercise our minds out of those habits.
And into the formation of other habits, like being more empathetic and being more loving. I think that's a good way to sum it all up.
I love you guys.